All right, so here we have AeonBTC, or Aeon. Aeon is a Bitcoin researcher, commentator, who's active on technical discussions about the network behavior, censorship-resistant. Brandon Black is a Bitcoin wallet engineer with a focus on sovereign custody solutions and financial privacy. Their discussion is titled The Free Market of Blockspace, Incentives, Spam, and Bitcoin's Permissionless Future.
Woo! How's the vibes out there, everybody? Having a good conference? Woo!
All right, so this was supposed to be a debate, like a filter kind of debate, but we couldn't get anyone to take the other side of the debate, and we're in agreement, so.
But if you want to take the other side, there's a mic over there.
Yeah, we want to encourage questions, comments, rebuttals throughout, because we know it's a contentious topic, and we'll try and maybe steel man a few topics, but yeah, I mean, I've been in Bitcoin. I run a site, censorship-resistant.com, where I kind of dive deep into these topics because I feel like they're not covered in the nuance that they should be in terms of Bitcoin security and the relation to the economic incentives and its play in the security model. And so we're going to go through those topics and just kind of do a fireside chat back and forth about this filter debate. Who is on the agreement of filters in Bitcoin being
Relay policy filters. You're a filter lover?
not many.
Good. We got
relay
lovers.
policy filters.
Let's
start with
other
that.
than DOS ones. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Will.
Let's start with that. Let's do just make a distinction between consensus and relay policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I was actually talking over lunch with someone, I don't think they're in the audience right now, but about this difference and we talk about the power of nodes in Bitcoin, and the power that nodes have, and the power that we saw exercised in the segregated witness UASF is the power to control consensus. If a block is mined that the nodes deem invalid, then the miner has foregone any reward for that block. And that is the ultimate power of nodes. That's why we say that nodes control Bitcoin at the end of the day, is because nodes control what is a valid block. And then there's this other thing that we have in Bitcoin, which is relay policy. And relay policy controls what transactions get to miners through a specific node. And that is not consensus. And so nodes rejecting transactions in relay does not block miners from getting rewarded for mining those transactions. And because a relay policy rule that blocks nodes from sending a transaction to miners doesn't prevent miners from being rewarded for mining that transaction, miners will find other ways to get those transactions. Somewhere in this building is our dear friend Portland HODL, who built a system specifically to enable that so that his client at the time, Mara, could get more revenue for their Bitcoin blocks because he enabled them to get transactions that wouldn't have made it through the relay network, but they still wanted because they could get revenue and fees for that. And so that's the critical difference here between consensus and relay, which is that with consensus, nodes hold the ultimate power. Because if nodes reject a block in consensus, the miners lose that revenue. But with relay, nodes rejecting a transaction from relay does not prevent miners from getting that revenue. So they have no power over miners there.
Yeah, essentially relay policy can only be enforced locally. So consensus is enforced globally through the network based on the protocol, and relay policy is enforced locally through your node. So you can set a highly restrictive relay policy or a highly unrestrictive one. And so people seem to think that, oh, if we get enough nodes that filter these transactions, then they're going to cost more money or it's going to be harder to get miners. But in reality, Bitcoin is designed to be redundant and robust. And so it's a flood type transaction propagation, so it goes to every node that's connected to every peer. And so it doesn't take many peers to circumvent any filtering. And we actually saw that just this last month with Subsat fee rates. So if anyone's familiar, the relay policy of Bitcoin is 1 sat per vbyte is the lowest amount. And that's pretty much 95+% of nodes run that policy.
It's probably 99.9.
Not probably 99, because Core, Knots, even Libra Relay enforces that policy. And so blocks that were empty for the last couple months. And so people started submitting 0.5 sats per vbyte, 0.4, 0.1. And they started out with spider pool or F2 pool started doing it because, again, this is a block space market. Miners, the way I like to present to people is think of it like any market dynamic. Block space is the commodity, miners sell it, and users purchase it. So you're bidding on it with your node. That's one of the benefits of running a node is being able to bid on block space, which is not often discussed as a power that a node has because that's direct financial incentive to the miner, saying to the miner, hey, I'm willing to pay this amount for this type of transaction.
You could almost say that right now, the reason Subsat per vbyte is making it to miners is that block space, there's an excess of it, so it's kind of on clearance sale. Block space is on clearance sale, and miners are trying to find ways to maximize their revenue by selling off that excess block space on clearance at lower fees.
Yeah. And miners are doing the work, and so why leave sats on the table when people are offering? It's like going into a store and they say, hey, I've got a bunch of extra food here, but I'd rather pay you $5 than $10. It's a market decision between the buyer and the seller. It has nothing to do with anyone else. Someone might not like that they're putting their inscription or doing something that they don't agree with, but the block space market is a free market, arguably the freest market that's ever existed in the history of humankind. So to try and encumber people or prevent people from accessing that block space is you're inherently working against the security model of Bitcoin because Bitcoin exists to, be resistant to censorship and be permissionless.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth saying kind of aloud here that aspect of Bitcoin being censorship resistant, if you think about it, the whole reason I think that Bitcoin has value is that nobody, not you or you or you, can stop me from transacting Bitcoin in the way that I want to. And the reason that is true is because the only rules that govern how I can transact are consensus rules. If you, by putting a policy on your node, could prevent me from transacting, whether that transaction happens to also contain data that could be interpreted as a picture or as a token or not, it doesn't matter. The fact is, if you, through some policy on your local node, could stop me from doing that, that would defeat the whole reason that I use Bitcoin in the first place, right? Bitcoin, at least to me, and I think hopefully to a lot of people in the everyone of Bitcoin is for everyone, Bitcoin has value because you can't stop me from transacting. And it doesn't matter whether that transaction has an associated image or has an associated token or is sub 1 sat per vbyte or is full RBF or whatever it might be inside that transaction. Bitcoin is valuable because you can't stop me. And so if we suddenly discovered that a relay policy on, even if all of you put a relay policy or node that tried to stop me, unless it was in the consensus rules of Bitcoin, if you could stop me, I would sell all my Bitcoin. I don't want that Bitcoin. I don't want a Bitcoin that people with their local relay policies can stop me from using in a way that I think is valuable.
Yeah, this goes back to running a node and the idea that, just spinning up nodes or having a certain percentage of nodes will enforce some policy. And so let's think of that in an adversarial sense. How much would it cost for a government to spin up 10,000 nodes? It's not very much for their budget. And so if they want to try and prevent, OFAC sanctioned transactions from reaching miners or whatever transactions they deem illegal or sanctioned, they just spin up 10,000, 20,000 nodes and now they are, encumbering these transactions. And so it assumes that Bitcoin can be Sybil attacked on the node level and it can't, It's because, we've seen it with the Subsat fees getting through. 99% of nodes are enforcing that. And again, it's because Bitcoin was designed to be censorship resistant. Like that's the whole point. And
I actually learned something cool just today because I had been wondering. So this filter discussion has been pretty active for pushing in 2 years now. It started to get more active around this change called full RBF by default, I think, or whatever it was, or whatever. Anyway, full RBF by default was when this kind of changing the relay policy on core became a more active conversation recently. And at the time, the way that we demonstrated that any transaction that had economic value would indeed make it to miners is that we ran a network of kind of a sub-network of Bitcoin nodes called Libre Relay that Aon mentioned. And that subnetwork would intentionally connect to each other to ensure reliable relay of certain transactions. And what we thought at the time was that we could get, with just a couple percent, like 2% of nodes, we could get reliable relay by preferentially peering. And that worked. That definitely worked. And that demonstrated that full RBF was a economically demanded type of transaction that miners would mine. What was surprising in this sub 1 sat per vbyte period is that, as Ann said again, Libre really did not relay it. So we had this preferential network that was to ensure reliable relay of consensus valid but relay invalid transactions. And here came this new kind of consensus valid, relay invalid transactions, and without us doing anything, they got to miners. And I just learned today why that is. And the reason is that Bitcoin nodes have a feature because they're trying to be Sybil resistant. They're trying to prevent censorship. That's part of the design of the system. One of the features in Bitcoin nodes is that they will, if they try to relay a transaction and it fails to relay, they will cycle through connections until they find one that relays it. So without us doing anything, without intentionally peering to make transactions get through, nodes actually will build a reliable relay for any consensus valid transaction to get to miners without us doing anything. And so Subsat per vbyte got through because nodes would just keep looking until they found someone to relay it, and then that node would keep looking until it found someone, and they all ended up therefore connected, and you have reliable relay of these consensus valid, by default, relay invalid transactions. And it turns out that Bitcoin is unbelievably well designed to be censorship resistant. And so you can't stop things with relay policy because the Bitcoin network is so well built to prevent that, and that's a beautiful thing. So I'm buying more Bitcoin.
That's a great point, because, thank you, yeah. I didn't realize that, because, yeah, I was like, how are these transactions getting through? They're not getting through private mempools, like no one's submitting them through Slipstream or anything. But that makes perfect sense. Just have your node, inherently have redundancy built in, where it's like, all right, it's rejecting this transaction. I'm going to just find someone who does. It makes perfect sense. But it goes into another nuanced topic about overly restrictive relay policy on your node actually handicaps your node in a way and makes it unreliable. Because, again, like if I'm trying to send you a transaction, your node's rejecting it, I'm not going to peer with you. And so it automatically does that. But also when these transactions show up in a block, which they inevitably will if there's an economic incentive, your node no longer has those transactions. So it has to go out and either download the full block or find the transactions in order to validate this block before it propagates it. So you're adding latency to your node. You're also potentially adding distortions in your fee estimation, because if you don't have the full list of, your mempool is not as thorough as it can be, you're ignoring certain people bidding on block space, and therefore you're not able to estimate the current rate of the fee of block space. So people, I don't think, realize that overly restrictive relay policy kind of isolates your node from consensus, because your node's always going to inherently follow consensus, and you can try and make it not, but it's going to have to catch up eventually, and that's just going to cost your node latency and resources along the way. So, any questions or comments? Or yeah, go ahead.
Sweet, we got several of it.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm new to nodes, and I'm curious, does running a node, is it possible to be discoverable through the internet by your internet service provider or others?
Well, it used to be. The V1 transport, I think, helps with that, doesn't it?
Yeah, V2 transport, yeah. So
Transport.
V2 transport introduces the ability to encrypt all of the traffic over that the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network uses, which then, if you run it on a non-standard port and you don't advertise that you're running it, would make it more difficult for someone to discover that you're running a node. That said, I mean, I run a public node, and I think there was a time 10, 12, 13 years ago when running a Bitcoin node could potentially get you in trouble with an ISP. As far as I know, I haven't heard anything about that in the US in many years. So I don't think there's a reason not to be discovered running a node. Because Bitcoin is a flood fill network where when you see a transaction or a block, you pass it to everybody you know. It's relatively difficult for even someone who knows you're running a node to track your financial activity, because you could just be forwarding a transaction, not sending your own transaction. Yeah, Will.
It's not on by default, but you're on the normal port normally.
Right, so by default, you use V2 transport on the normal port. So if you set up a listening node by default, it's very easy for someone to see that you're there. In terms of traffic analysis, V2 transport was built to be not obvious, to be ambiguous as to what kind of traffic it is. Probably with sophisticated kind of timing analysis, someone could see block relay happening and detect that's a Bitcoin node, but it is all encrypted and it's not obvious that it's structured as Bitcoin or something.
I'm confused as how what you described could even work in terms of like how it keeps retrying the failed ones. Wouldn't it only do that if it was considered a valid relayable thing to begin with? Like, I don't, yeah.
Right, so any transaction that's going to be sent is started by a node who considers it valid. So someone out there wants to make a sub 1 sat per VByte transaction.
So the really weird ones will find each other, basically.
Exactly, the weirdos will find each other.
And so, yeah, so that made me think like, oh, so like, it almost sounds like the dust filter is useless in that case, but it's still, I think, serving a purpose as like a to prevent DOS. Those things too, both things can be true in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's not. This is an important aspect of where relay policy is very important. So when we're up here talking about, relay filters are useless, blah, 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 they're useless except. And the except is that every individual node has a strong incentive, and the network as a whole has a strong incentive for relay policy to protect nodes from denial of service attacks. And that's so like originally when Bitcoin was built, there was a 0 minimum fee. But that enabled anybody to just send infinite transactions without economic cost to themselves through nodes, so anybody could then just DOS any node off the network. So we need to have some level of minimum fee as a basic spam filter to prevent DOS of nodes. The question is, what is the minimum basic fee that is sufficiently large to prevent destruction of node services? And then also, what is the minimum incremental fee for relaying a new version of a transaction? Because what you want to make sure is that someone who wants to knock your node off the network would have to pay a prohibitively large number of sats to do so. And that's really where relay policy is a critical feature of Bitcoin. So no one up here is advocating getting rid of relay policy completely, even though I kind of wish we could. That wouldn't make sense, because that would enable anybody to, for 0 cost, just knock Bitcoin nodes off the network, because Bitcoin nodes do this flood fill relay thing, and you would get transactions, any number of transactions, just relay them all, and you would just knock you off the network in no time. So we have to have some relay policy, and there's a nuance here. I think it makes sense to be reducing this 1 sat per VByte to a lower minimum right now, because the 1 sat per VByte was put in like 10 years ago when Bitcoin cost $200 a coin or something. And now Bitcoin is $100,000 a coin. Why would we have the same Satoshi cost to protect from DOS now as we did when it was 1,000 times less costly? So there's a kind of a, we haven't changed it in too long situation.
Yeah, I would actually push back and say that relay policy is irrelevant unless, like, it's the idea, like, people make the argument, well, relay policy, it worked in the past, filters worked in the past, but the actual thing that was different was the economic incentive. And so with the subsat bytes, as we said, 99% of nodes, and it was the economic incentive that organically made that propagate the network. And so there is no economic incentive for 0 sats per VByte. I mean, in consensus, you could send a transaction for 0 sats of VByte, a miner can mine it, it's fully consensus valid, and it's just relay policy that supposedly prevents it. But I would argue that it's economic incentive that is what's doing the preventing and not relay policy at all. I would say more what protects a node from going offline is max mempool size and being able to limit how many transactions you're holding in your mempool. But as far as having a 0 sat VByte or VByte, miners have no incentive for that. You might have incentive to relay it on your node, but that opens your node specifically for attack. But I think it's more related to economic incentive than just the relay technical red tape.
I think those are both true, actually. There needs to be space between the minimum value in fees that a miner is going to accept and what would risk nodes being cheaply knocked off the network by DOS. And fortunately, of course, miners have 0 incentive to accept 0 sat per VByte. So there's always some minimal space where if nodes relay only above some threshold in fees, that's sufficient to get all transactions that miners would care about. And as long as that space exists where nodes can charge something, and that's what miners care about, we're fine. And fortunately, that does work. So yes, it's kind of both yes.
Another more question?
Thanks very much for clarifying the relay policy versus consensus policy. And yeah, that feels much more clear now. My question is more about what was the purpose of the change in increasing the op return size from its 40 bytes to whatever X? And also, why perhaps was it no longer a configurable thing that a node operator could change? That kind of, the change aspect of that. Thanks.
That's a great question. I'm glad to discuss it. So we had this situation, and the history of this, let's say, op return was created in Bitcoin because there was a misincentive, a malincentive to create unspendable outputs as a way of storing data. So there was a protocol called Counterparty, there was another one called Omni, there was another one called, there was another one. There were a bunch of protocols that were using unspendable outputs, but that you couldn't prove were unspendable in order to store data in Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin developers very intelligently created a safe place to create unspendable outputs that are provably unspendable. And because they're provably unspendable, they have no long-term validation cost to Bitcoin nodes. So that was what op return was created for. Subsequently, we had the invention of the inscriptions protocol for putting JPEGs on chain, or as some people like to say, for putting dick butts on chain. Bitcoin is peer-to-peer dick butt money. So the inscriptions protocol created this totally other space for putting stuff on Bitcoin. This space did not have the consequence of unspendable outputs the way that these historical protocols did. And it had this weird nuance. And that weird nuance is that it is cheaper to use this inscriptions protocol, which is reasonably safe. It does not harm nodes. It does not cause unspendable outputs and forever validation cost. And it's cheaper to do that as long as your data is greater than 143 bytes or something. I forget the exact number, but it's somewhere in the 140 to 150 range. Below that, it's cheaper to use an op return type of output. But op returns, depending on your node implementation, were limited to either 40 or 80 bytes. So we had this weird disincentive where for data between either 40 or 80 and 140-ish bytes, it was still best to use unspendable outputs using keys. And so that's why the op return limit was lifted. It was to get rid of that weird malincentive in that narrow range between either 40 or 80 and 140 bytes, so that people would either just use an op return or just use an inscription, but not do this bad thing of making unspendable outputs using keys.
And then I would add part of that is just bringing relay policy closer to consensus. Because again, as economic incentives shift, we talk about post-subsidy era, not maybe about 2130, but maybe like 2030 or 2032, where the subsidy is really minuscule. You're going to see a lot of incentive for miners to find any fee they can get in these transactions. And as that happens, if your node is overly restrictive with its relay policy, it's just going to add latency to the network and handicap your node in that sense. So to me, an argument that comes from the filter side, they say, well, give nodes the choice to like customize it. But if the knob is useless and the customization only hinders your own node, why would you give that to a user? So I agree with the fact of bringing relay policy closer to consensus, because the economics as time goes on will change towards the most ruthless block space, free market that you can imagine.
I think it's a really important thing that's worth spending a little more time on, that why not just give users more options? And Bitcoin Core has a responsibility, and I think it's a very, very serious responsibility that the maintainers of Bitcoin Core take very seriously. And that responsibility is to maintain the Bitcoin network as a reliable service for the Bitcoin money that serves a $2 trillion asset. And to do that, they have several kind of sub-responsibilities. Like one is they need to make sure that the transactions miners want get relayed to miners through the network, because as far as we know, to the best that we understand Bitcoin, there is material risk of harm if many transactions are getting to miners through private mempools. Okay, so that's one responsibility that Bitcoin Core has, is to get the transactions miners want to miners. Okay, but we could still leave a configuration option in there for users. Okay, well, why would you leave an option for users? Well, users might have a a good reason, like for example, to get their node to run more reliably, to have their node be more efficient, to have their node provide better services to them, better fee estimation. They might want to have a better vision of future blocks to get, if they wanted to get a very slow transaction confirmed. So some knobs we have to leave, like the size of the mempool. So some people are going to want very large mempools because that serves their needs better. But there isn't a reason for users to be able to adjust the data relay, the op return size on their nodes. They either get the best services by leaving it just unlimited, or they get somewhat worse services depending on how much they reduce it. And there's no case in which changing that setting provides a better service to the user, except that they might not relay some transaction they don't like, but feels cannot be what Bitcoin Core runs their policy on. It has to be, there's a material improvement in the services provided by this Bitcoin node to a user of the Bitcoin network. And so you'll see that if you look through Bitcoin options that are available, they're there because some user would get better services for their purposes from that option. But if that option doesn't provide better services for some demonstrable reason that a user would want those services, they can't leave the option because then it's just code weight that puts the whole network at a slightly greater risk of some bug in the future because there's still code they're maintaining that's not providing specific services to users of the Bitcoin network. And so they're in this very tight place where they're Bitcoin Core, people are like, oh, they have so much power, but the actuality of the Bitcoin Core maintainers is they're in this very tight place where they have to toe this line. This option, we can't justify code cost unless a user is going to get a better service, and we have to ensure reliable relay of transactions to miners, and that's the only space they can operate in.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's a concrete thing. Like users would say, I need a larger mempool because I need fee estimation that goes out 100 blocks for my business, or I need to have the option to turn off the mempool entirely because my node can't process the mempool live. I'm limited on bandwidth. Users have to say, this is the reason I need it for this service, and I don't like that transaction is not a service. That's just I don't like it. There's not I don't have the bandwidth, or I need further estimation, or some concrete, like my business requires, my usage of Bitcoin requires.
And objectively, yeah, you want your node to be as close to the chain tip as quick as possible in a coordination network, and that's what you're trying to do. So, and just one last note, because our time's up, I'd like to remind everyone that value is subjective. Like, I have no care about ordinals, I don't care about inscriptions, I have no interest in them, but I understand the economics of Bitcoin and the security model, and I realize that, someone might consider that valuable to them, and it's their money. If Bitcoin's people say Bitcoin's money, it's like, all right, Bitcoin's money. Let people spend their money on block space wherever they want. And value is subjective, and that's just how it is, and it doesn't matter if we agree with it.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.